Before I announce this year's winner, I'm going to give you just a little bit of historical context behind this work. So bear with me for a moment here, if you will. The poetry of modernism was first and foremost an art of experiment, and not just in the sense of experimental form. The major poets of the early 20th century performed experiments on the page, not unlike Einstein's famous thought experiments. The physicist imagined a train traveling at the speed of light with a fly inside it moving forward at a much more leisurely pace. And the resultant theory was an intervention into reality that reshaped the world. The poets were out to understand what language is and how we make meaning, and so Wallace Stevens investigated the nature of the imagination. Gertrude Stein broke sentences to examine the way syntax shaped consciousness, and T.S. Eliot tested the degree to which a poem could speak in a voice that belonged to no one. They set aside not just rhyme and meter and the Victorian and Edwardian sentimentality they despised, they banished to a large degree psychology, the study of character and motivation, of the profound struggles of human beings to become themselves. This simply was not their focus. The reclamation of psychology didn't come until the 1950s, when Robert Lowell transformed the landscape in America and England with Life Studies, a groundbreaking book intent on studying the internal pressures that inform and distort us, in poems unafraid to examine whatever troubled the speaker, who is a version, of course, of Robert Lowell. This is not simply experience transcribed, but a work of high artifice, a performance in which, as the poet said, I wanted the reader to feel that he was getting the real Robert Lowell. At this moment, an insidious term, confessional poetry, was born. It was a misnomer because Lowell was not asking absolution, but seeking insight, asking for absolution, but seeking insight. These poems are less like monologues muttered to a priest than they are like probing, exploratory addresses to a therapist. Poets have been cudgeled with the term ever since, charged with self-indulgence, particularly if they happen to be women or men who are willing to reveal their own vulnerability through engagement with aspects of experience that make us uncomfortable. A few years ago, when I was teaching at Sarah Lawrence College outside of New York, a young man came to me and said, I don't want to write confessional poetry. I said, what would you like to write? He said, well, I want to write about my life. Now, I've given you this capsule bit of American poetic history because the poet the trustees of the Griffin Trust have chosen to honor tonight, Frank Bidart, is a psychological seer. A consummate student of human desire, obsession, and shame, of what it is to be a soul that, as he has written, learns once again the body it loves and hates is made of earth and will betray it. Although he was a student and protege of Lowell's, his work seems sui generis. He sounds like no one else. The formal properties of his poems are notably his own, placing words in white space with a deliberate gravity, using capitalization and punctuation to, as he has said, fasten the voice to the page. What he shares with Lowell is commitment to the investigation of shadow country, the mysterious and troubled nature of what we used to call the human heart, longing, rage and envy, guilt and self-contempt, the allure of what we cannot have, the terror of being mortal. Bidart has turned that tired term, confessional poetry, inside out and hung it up by its ears. His probing, searching poems are sometimes spoken by a version of the self, but he is also the most accomplished practitioner of the dramatic monologue in our time. These voices come from extremities of experience, from the edges of the imaginable, in voices dislocated by trauma. The child murderer Herbert White looks down on his gathered victims in the woods by the side of the road. Ellen West, the subject of the first case study of an anorectic, punishes her body extravagantly for being a body, attempting to purify herself. Someone like John Wayne Gacy hides the failures of the past by dragging them into the crawl space beneath the house. The mind of Václav Nijinsky shatters as he takes on, in a sacrificial self-immolation, the psychic weight of impending world war. In these riveting monologues, in his short lyrics, and in the great long poems centered on the dark hours of a night of body and spirit, Bidart seems fearless in his willingness to take on the difficult. If I make his work seem ferocious, that is because it is. Written with an eye always on what is at stake, which is everything, how we are helpless in the face of our longings, fate embedded in the lineaments of desire, desire itself hopelessly surrounded by what cannot be eluded, what even the gods call given. Therefore, it may be surprising to hear that these poems are neither nihilistic nor utterly disconsolate, because Bidart believes that the nature of our species is to make, and that the necessary project of our being is to make something commensurate with the scale of our desire. These haunting, inescapable poems, gathered now in 9 volumes with a collected one on the way, represent an architecture built over a lifetime out of necessity, a structure of insight and of radical empathy. Frank Bidart's life work is a rigorous affirmation of the ways art can, through the exactitude of naming and the forging of music, constitute a kind of self-redemption. Please welcome Frank Bidart.
The question on my mind is, what can I give you tonight in return? Tomorrow night, I'm going to read my poetry. But what note do I want to leave you with tonight? The best thing I can think of is to read you a poem, not by me, that seems to me to reflect some central wisdom about poetry. One of the most impressive things about the Griffin Trust is that it doesn't seem to be advocating, pushing some particular idea about how poets should write poetry. It's very rare that there isn't such advocacy behind a prize. In my lifetime, so many polemical visions of what poetry should be have been fashionable, from the new formalism to confessional poetry, West Coast beat to academic East Coast, from the manners of the avant-garde to plain speech minimalism. Each fashion passes. Each passionately held set of aesthetic ideas comes in time to seem to have worn out its animating energy. All art, of course, is artifice. To construct the simulacrum of necessary speech is an art, for which, if the history of art teaches us anything, there are no rules. The history of taste is not the history of art. This is a cruel law, but also a liberating one. The poem about writing poetry that I want to read to you tonight is by a Hungarian poet, Attila József. It is translated by John Batke. It can be found in a superb anthology edited by Seamus Heaney and Ted Hughes, The Rattle Bag. József died in 1937. I hope the listener will not be distracted by the poem's thoroughgoing innocence about gender. The only poet in this poem about being a writer is male. Instead of pushing a particular style or aesthetic, Attila József's poem throws the emphasis on what is at stake for the writer in the act of making the poem. What is risked, which only the writer can know. A radical sincerity, radical investment, radical presence that has nothing to do with literal or anecdotal sincerity. What must be at stake must be not less than everything. Here is the poem. The 7th. If you set out in this world, better be born 7 times. Once in a house on fire, once in a freezing flood, once in a wild madhouse, once in a field of ripe wheat, once in an empty cloister, and once among pigs in a sty. 6 babes crying, not enough. You yourself must be the 7th. When you must fight to survive, let your enemy see 7. One away from work on Sunday, one starting his work on Monday, one who teaches without payment, one who learned to swim by drowning, one who is the seed of a forest, and one whom wild forefathers protect. But all their tricks are not enough. You yourself must be the 7th. If you want to find a woman, let 7 men go for her. One who gives his heart for words, one who takes care of himself, one who claims to be a dreamer, one who through her skirt can feel her, one who knows the hooks and snaps, one who steps upon her scarf. Let them buzz like flies around her. You yourself must be the seventh. If you write and can afford it, let 7 men write your poem. One who builds a marble village, one who was born in his sleep, one who charts the sky and knows it, one whom words call by his name, one who perfected his soul, and one who dissects living rats. 2 are brave, and 4 are wise. You yourself must be the 7th. And if all went as was written, you will die for 7 men. One who is rocked and suckled, one who grabs a hard young breast, one who throws down empty dishes, one who helps the poor to win, one who works till he goes to pieces, one who just stares at the moon. The world will be her tombstone. You yourself must be the 7th. Thank you. Writing Ellen West was exorcism. Exorcism of that thing within Frank that wanted, after his mother's death, to die. Inside him was that thing that he must expel from him to live. He read The Case of Ellen West as a senior in college and immediately wanted to write a poem about it, but couldn't. So he stored it, as he has stored so much that awaits existence. Unlike Ellen, he was never anorexic, but like Ellen, he was obsessed with eating and the arbitrariness of gender and having to have a body. Ellen lived out the war between the mind and the body, lived out in her body each stage of the war, its journey and progress, in which compromise, reconciliation is attempted, then rejected, then mourned, till she reaches at last in an ecstasy costing not less than everything: death. He was grateful he was not impelled to live out the war in his body, hiding in compromise, well wadded with art he adored and with stupidity and distraction. The particularity inherent in almost all narrative, though contingent and exhausting, tells the story of the encounter with particularity that flesh as flesh must make. Ellen West was written in the year after his mother's death. By the time she died, he had so thoroughly betrayed the ground of intimacy on which his life was founded, he had no right to live. No use for him to tell himself that he shouldn't feel this because he felt this. He didn't think this, but he thought this. After she died, his body wanted to die, but his brain, his cunning, didn't. He likes narratives with plots that feel as if no one willed them. His mother, in her last year, revealed that she wanted him to move back to Bakersfield and teach at Bakersfield College and live down the block. He thought his mother, without knowing that this is what she wanted him to die. All he had told her in words and more than words for years was that her possessiveness and terror at his independence were wrong, wrong, wrong. He was the only person she wanted to be with, but he refused to live down the block. And then she died. And must be lifted from the mind, must be lifted and placed elsewhere, must not remain in the mind alone. Out of the 1,000 myriad voices, 1,000 myriad stories in each human head, when his mother died, there was Ellen West. This is the body that you can draw out of you to expel from you the desire to die. Give it a voice. Give each scene of her life a particularity and necessity that in Binswanger's recital are absent. Enter her skin so that you can then make her other and expel her. Survive her. Animal mind, eating the ground of Western thought, the mind-body problem. She who in the last months of her life abandoned writing poems in disgust at the failure of her poems is a poem. She in death is incarnated on a journey whose voice is the voice of her journey. Arrogance of Plutarch, of Shakespeare and Berlioz, who thought they made what Cleopatra herself could not make. Arrogance of the maker. Werther killed himself, and then young men all over Europe imitated him and killed themselves. But his author, Goethe, cunning master of praxis, lived. Frank thought, when anything is made, it is made not by its likeness, not by its twin or mirror, but its opposite. Ellen, in his poem, asks, without a body, who can know himself at all? In your pajamas, you move down the stairs just to the point where the adults couldn't yet see you, to hear more clearly the din, the sweet cacophony of adults partying. Phonograph voices among them. Phonograph voices, they're magpie beauty. Magpie beauty. One more poem, one more book, in which you figure out how to make something out of not knowing enough.